So, I think I'm going to start, because I've done this before, and if I give people 10 minutes on the first day, then it becomes 20 minutes on the second day, and by the last day, I'm actually starting the day after I'm supposed to. So, I'm going to start, and people can catch up. So, welcome, everybody, to this wonderful course, which we've called A Practical Guide to PPP and Privatization, which has been designed specifically for NCP in Saudi Arabia and by NCP in Saudi Arabia. So I will start off by giving you a bit of an introduction and a background, starting with the NCP, which, as you all know, is an organization now under the Ministry of Finance that was set up to support the government's PPP and privatization program. I'm going to sit down in a minute because I feel like some kind of puppet jumping up and down here. So we do three main things. Establishing the legal, regulatory, and institutional framework for PPP and privatization. And if you don't know what those things are, you will know by the end of next week, certainly, after this course. We also support sectors and ministries in actually implementing transactions. We have a transactions team which can be used to help you actually do things, and capacity building, which is why we're all here today. And so, who am I? This is a question I ask myself every day when I get up in the morning and look in the mirror. I'm a staff member of the Strategic Communications and Marketing section in NCP. We're responsible for the capacity building and also supporting transactions on marketing. I have been advising governments and investors as a consultant and as an employee and as an investment banker for more than 30 years. And that includes more than 15 years in the MENA region, not all in Saudi Arabia. I spent 4 years in Damascus. I spent about 15 months in Iraq, 5 or 6 years in Abu Dhabi, and I've been working here part-time certainly for the last 8 or 9 years and full-time for the last year, and I'm now based here in Riyadh. One of the things I like to boast about is that I've actually done PPP and privatization. Privatization itself, as you'll get to hear a bit later, was very popular in the 80s and 90s. But now it's not as common, mainly because most countries have actually privatized everything they're going to privatize. But of course, Saudi Arabia is quite new to it, whereas PPP started becoming popular in the early 2000s. So you'll get lots of people who know things about PPPs, but less people who know stuff about privatization. I have done relevant work on these two things for more than 260 organizations. Not all of them were transactions, some of them were strategies and restructuring, and in 26 countries covering most sectors. I started off in telecoms, and spent a lot of time in power as well, but I've done water, I've done, what was the weirdest one I've done? Yes, a watch repair shop in Tanzania. That was the weirdest privatization I did. And I worked on PPP stuff here in Saudi Arabia for the Royal Commission for Jubail and Yanbu, for the Ministry of Municipalities. We were looking at a PPP for municipal inspections in Mecca. I did a screening and scoping piece of work for the Food and Drugs Authority, and you'll find out what that means a bit later, if you don't know already. And I did some work for Saudi Customs on their X-ray machines. And I am an accredited trainer for the World Bank CP3P program, which is a certification for PPPs. I was actually one of the editors of the certification guide. So if you've heard of the certification thing, I will tell you that I've not copied any of the slides from there. All of these slides are original. If any of you actually ever does the CP3 course, you'll find that the slides are just like bullets after bullets after bullets. And I find that stuff quite boring, but I still do it. So why are we here? What are the objectives of this training? This is going to be a five-day course. After doing the last one, 5 days, one after the other, everybody was exhausted. And even me, normally I'm very happy to hear the sound of my own voice, but I was getting fed up with it myself by the end. So I don't know what the audience felt like. So we're splitting this one up. We're doing 2 days this week, today and tomorrow, and then 3 days next week, Sunday, Monday, and Tuesday. And just note that the venue next week is a different hotel. It's a very busy period. So next week it's going to be the Roche Rotana hotel, which is on the flyer that you got through the email. And we're here basically to improve everyone's understanding of PPP and privatization. Obviously, the emphasis is on how it's applied here in Saudi Arabia, and to provide you with practical know-how. It's one of the differences between this and the CP3P is that the World Bank designed the CP3P to be like best practice. And for me, I've been doing this for a long time, and so I'm trying to include the actual practical bits, where the theory might say this, but in practice, it's easier if you do that kind of thing. So you'll find a lot of practical stuff in there. And how I'm doing this, well, we've got all the slides, the usual death by PowerPoint. There'll be Q&As at the end of most of the sections, basically questions that will come up on the screen, and you have to race up to answer them. Then there's also quizzes, there's group work and discussions, just to make things more interesting and to give me a break. And throughout the text there are some case studies, real-life examples that I got from the internet or from my own experience. And at the end there's going to be a test, yes, we'll talk about that right at the end. I don't want to worry you all. Actually, it shouldn't worry you. The last one I did, everybody passed, so that was pretty good. But it is a real test. It's not like one of these that you just have to show up and pass. You actually have to do some work and tick some boxes. So out of this, you will understand the practical implications, if you don't already, of PPP, privatization, structuring, which is a buzzword that's used in PPPs a lot, especially. Whereas privatization, they use the word restructuring, which you'll find out what that is too a bit later. Talk about the tender process. Some of you who've done tenders maybe for normal procurement, buying stuff or buying consultancy services, might think there's only like one way forward on a tender. There's actually various different models you can use depending on what you need. And we'll be talking about something that's very important, contract management. My experience has been as a transaction advisor, so generally my work stops at the end of the successful tender or a failed tender in some cases. And there's definitely a sensation of, we're done, great, we can sit back and relax. That's fine for the advisors. It's not so good for the government because contract management is where you get all the benefits that you're supposed to be getting. But it is something that tends to be neglected. So we'll be talking about that a bit and what needs to be done on the contract management side. We'll be covering specific features from the system and process here in Saudi Arabia, although I should say now that the process that is set out in the Privatization Projects Manual, which has been issued by NCP, is under review, and some features of it may change in the coming months. So I won't spend too much time on that, but I will be looking at the general principles of how you do each of these stages. And of course, potential problems and how to address them. The target audience is basically the less experienced. If you've been doing transactions for 5 or 10 years, you probably know 60, 70% of this stuff. If you've worked on one or maybe just started or just been appointed, then this is definitely for you, I hope. So before we proceed, quickly, who have we got in here? Who has had experience of working on a PPP or a privatization? Actually being part of a working team or a transaction team? Anybody? 1, 2. Ah, great. So that's good. You've all come to the right course then. Unless you were here for, I don't know, architectural design, which is in the room next door. So, outline. What are we going to be looking at? We're going to start off, as in any good textbook, by some definitions and by an overview of PPP and privatization here in Saudi Arabia. And from there, we'll be looking at PPPs. And we'll be looking, particularly structuring the thing on what's called the PPP process cycle, which is the various stages in running a PPP. And following that, we'll be doing the same thing for privatization. The privatization section is a bit shorter. There are a number of reasons for this. One is that there aren't so many privatizations, because privatization is taking an existing institutional service and selling it or handing it over to the private sector. So once you've done it, you've done it. Whereas for PPP, it's a method of procurement. So you're buying stuff, and of course you just go on forever and ever buying new power plants or roads and stuff like that. So people tend to focus more on PPP, but because I know that certainly some of the sectors are looking at some major privatizations coming up, we've definitely got plenty in there. And finally, a few bits and pieces that apply to both, because although the two are very different, which I will be talking about in a moment, certain things, specifically the tender process, are the same or very similar. So these are basically what I used to call hot topics. They're just things that are important, that I found are important when I'm doing tenders and structuring privatizations, such as setting your objectives. Probably the most important step right at the beginning. Because if you don't know what your objectives are, then you're not going to get them, basically. We'll be looking at different options for the tender process, looking at timetable. We will, particularly because my experience of government, and this is around the world, in every one of those 26 countries, is that when government finally takes a decision to have a transaction, to privatize something or to have a PPP, they then say, okay, we want it all done by yesterday. And that's fine. If you tell an advisor, I insist that you finish this tender in 6 months, my response was, okay, I can do that, but watch out because it's risky. If you take shortcuts, you're not really taking shortcuts. You're just storing up bigger problems for later. We'll look at some of the documents that you do. In fact, I'm just preparing a specific course on transaction documents, which is only, I would suggest, for those of you who really want to be lawyers, which I hope is nobody in this room. Qualification criteria, how to set your evaluation criteria, regulation, and then finally at the end, since I've been beaten up by governments for so long, how to work with transaction advisors and what to watch out for. Hopefully, and this is very indicative, we'll go as fast or as slow as we need to go, and it'll be up to you. But I hope to get to the end of today, halfway through the PPP process, and by the end of tomorrow, we'll be in some of the key topics and issues within PPP, like financing, the business case, value for money. And then the rest we'll cover next week. In terms of how I do this, it's very informal. If you have a question, stick your hand up or shout out the question. And we'll, as I say, we'll take as long or as quick as you need as we go through. Let me know if I'm going too fast, or if you can't understand what I'm saying, or if I'm going too slow. It's very, I'm trying to make this interactive and potentially more interesting. I once did a course on PPP and on presentation skills, And there, the guy said I should involve the audience, and he recommended doing some aerobics at the start of the session. I'm sure you'll be glad to hear that I'm not planning to do that, mainly because I couldn't do them myself. So I shall sit down for a little while, just to make life a bit different for me. Did you get a copy of the slides, by the way? Yeah, okay, so by email, yeah, because I think there's a lot of them. So we didn't print up 300 and something slides for everybody, but hopefully you got soft copies, which is good, basically. So we'll start at the beginning, which is a good place to start, I think. And let's talk about some history for Saudi Arabia. The country has actually been doing privatization, certainly, since 1970. And we had, when SABIC was floated on the stock market, during the 80s, we had a bunch of other IPOs, which is initial public offer. By the way, those of you, if you have slides at the end, there is a set of acronyms, because you'll find that PPP and privatization use lots of acronyms. It's like I'm an economist, and economists are always accused of using lots of weird and wonderful terms for everyday stuff to make us sound more intelligent. And it's the same with acronyms. So there's a whole bunch of acronyms. So if there's something on a slide like IPO or IWPP, if you don't want to ask me what it means, then just go to the back. Also, at the very last slide, I've included a bunch of references, various books and articles and websites that I've found to be useful, that you can refer to. Everything on there is free. You can download a whole bunch of stuff. So you don't just need to base it on this. Anyway, back to where I was going. So we had a bunch of IPOs, which is initial public offer, floating on the stock market for basically banks, insurance companies, STC and Marden. And we, since then, in 2017, with the start of the Vision 2030 especially, NCP was set up, and the program has been going, the formal program linked to Vision 2030 has been going since then. So PPP and privatization is, as it says here, at the heart of Vision 2030. Vision 2030 is a transformative plan. The idea is to change the whole structure of the Saudi economy and the social interactions between the population. And boosting the role of the private sector is a key part of that. It's not the only part of that by any means. Quality of life and things like that are also extremely important. But there are some key parts of the Vision 2030 strategic objectives which involve basically the private sector and therefore PPP and privatization. In particular, the aim is to increase the contribution of the private sector from 40 to 65% of GDP. And that will be done by a bunch of things. And certain objectives in the plan include privatization. They include reducing government spending, which is sometimes it's a result of privatization and PPP. Increasing private sector participation, creating new jobs. That is a key part of PPP and sometimes privatization. Attracting foreign investment. Clearly, if we are bringing in foreign partners as part of the PPP and privatization strategy, then we're going to be bringing in foreign investment as well, which is a good thing. Improving quality of service, and all of these others. All of these map onto the PPP and privatization program as one of the mechanisms. So, looking a bit closer, there are three pillars of the PPP and privatization strategy, which correspond to the things that NCP does, basically, as I mentioned before. We've got the legal and regulatory framework. At the moment, there are a draft PPP law, which is going through. It was put out for public comment about a year ago now, and it's going through the process, and hopefully it should be passed in the coming months. There are rules for the Privatization Supervisory Committee that were released, and also, as I mentioned, NCP has published the Privatization Projects Manual, which is basically a process manual for how you actually implement transactions and structure them. There have been some institutional changes. We've got the NCP coming up. We have the privatization supervisory committees for each of 12 sectors. They'll come up a bit later. And then we have supporting programs we're developing, or each sector is developing their programs. Some are further than others, but everybody's working on them. Each sector is doing a strategy and setting up a pipeline of potential opportunities and actual transactions. So here are the 12 sectors, which are quite clear. They're basically, they're not called ministries for some reason, but they're linked to the ministries, to relevant ministries. And that includes more than 100 PPP and privatization projects as we speak. In fact, it's probably closer to 150, 200 now. So that was the basic introduction, and we'll do a bit of definitioning because some of you may be asking yourself, well, what is a PPP? I've heard this phrase a lot, and I don't know what it is. Well, I'll tell you what it is. Public-private partnerships are a method of procurement in the same way that running a tender for an EPC, engineering, procurement and construction, say you want somebody to build a school if you're in the education sector. The traditional method is to say, right, we'll put out some plans, we'll put out an advert and say, come and bid me to build me this school. That's the traditional way. And the PPP option for this is, and basically they bid, you pick the cheapest, you pay them after they built it. With a PPP, you say, come and build me this school, and by the way, you're going to pay for it as well as build it. But in return, you can operate it for, say, the next 15 or 20 years, and either we'll pay you or the users will pay you. So that's a big difference, particularly in timing. But PPP, just to be very clear, PPP is not a policy. You don't do a PPP as government just so you can go and boast about having done a PPP, right? You don't say, oh, my policy, you'll see those policies and strategies I put up on the screen. None of them says, you know, the aim of this, the objective of Vision 2030 is not to have PPPs. The objective is to boost the private sector and do all these other nice things that I mentioned. PPP is just one of the ways to get there. And in particular, it is just a type of procurement. In the same way that sticking an ad in the paper or back in the past, you know, governments didn't even have the private sector do stuff, they just did it themselves. My very first job, I worked for the government of St. Vincent and the Grenadines in the Caribbean. My life has been downhill ever since then. It was living on a Caribbean island for 4 years was like, you know, my dream. And they had a Ministry of Public Works. So they didn't use private contractors to build roads, they had their own ministry to build it. So that was back in the day. And now, of course, it's all done by private contractors with private contracts. But these may not be PPPs, they are just traditional procurement. There is a World Bank definition. There's not a generally accepted global definition for PPPs, but there is a World Bank definition, in fact, there are two World Bank definitions, and this is the broadest one. PPP is a long-term contract between a public party and a private party for the development or management of a public asset or service in which the private agent bears significant risk and management responsibility throughout the life of the project, and remuneration is significantly linked to performance and or demand for the asset or service. That's quite long-winded, and it basically comes down to four things. PPP is about risk. It's about sharing risk between the public sector and the private sector. PPP is long-term. It is much longer term than your traditional EPC contract, which ends when you accept the building or whatever it is that they built for you. And pay is the pay of the investor, the private partner. Usually I call them contractor. Do not confuse that with the construction company. Just when I say contractor, I mean the guy running the PPP. Pay is linked to performance. And one of the things that may surprise you is that PPP is often associated with using the private sector to finance projects. Mainly because when it's done in emerging markets, it's done in countries that have no money. So they see it as a way of getting cheap money, which is not actually true. We'll come to that later. But it doesn't have to be about getting the financing. The benefits come from other parts of it, not the financing. This is the definition in the draft privatization law, which I will not read out to you, but I will say that it is compatible with the international definition. It's just a bit more detailed. So, what is privatization? One of the things that I've found in my experience is that people tend to see PPP and privatization either as the same thing or as two parts of a whole. And in fact, privatization is a very different creature to PPPs. And hopefully by the end of this course, you'll be very clear on that. There are a lot of overlaps, a lot of similarities, but the fundamental concept of privatization is different to the fundamental concept of PPP. So, my definition, which I just wrote down, is basically transfer of a business, industry, or service from the public to private ownership and control. Now, I put "and control" in brackets because I'm being polite, and we'll see why in a moment. So some of the features there is privatization is permanent. Right? Once you've done it, you've done it. Of course, government can renationalize things and take them back and everything, but in general, it's permanent. The second important point is that the private sector should have management, financial, operational, and technical control, because that's how you get the benefits and the improvements. Why do you privatize stuff? If they're making huge piles of money and really efficient and world-class, you don't need to. You might as well stay there and just take the profits. You normally privatize something because you want to improve performance. However, control does not mean you have to sell a majority stake. Because you'll see, and this is the issue, you look at some of these privatizations by IPOs in the past, government has floated maybe 20, 30% on the stock exchange, and yet it's still called privatization. Because it's about how you manage the company, not so much how much you sell. So the draft privatization law is a much broader definition. It doesn't mention management control, but it talks about transfer of ownership of assets, shares, or rights from the government to the private party. So this does not require a sharing control. And you can argue, for example, that here we have STC. The IPO of STC was 16.23%, which effectively government is still by far the largest shareholder and ultimately still controls STC, although it's at more arm's length than it used to be. But it still counts as privatization. Certainly, it's still treated by the government as privatization. And the final thing is, in the privatization projects manual, it treats PPP as a subset of privatization. Strictly speaking, this is not true, as you'll find out on the next slide. And the next draft of the manual, I believe, will be differentiating them a lot more, because they're not a subset. One is not a subset of the other. So, They are similar. As I've said, I'll stand up again this is like sit down for a bit, you get bored of that, stand up, and make life more interesting. So privatization is, as we say here, they're similar but not the same. So privatization is the sale of a government business. PPP generally is new investment and services, although it can be getting private sector to operate your existing assets as well, or it might be, once you've done your first contract, you're still doing PPPs, but it's not necessarily new. But let's call it new investment and services. So the similarities, they both involve private investment, even if it's just investment in people and time. They have similar tender processes except for the IPO, and they both affect what you might call traditional government activities. 20 years ago, government did, in most countries, pretty much everything from building roads, delivering power, telecoms, research, so they both involve that kind of thing. So what are the differences? The differences are that privatization is permanent, it's forever, not just for Christmas, as we used to say in the UK, referring to pets rather than privatization. That's a different thing. It applies to existing assets or shares. You cannot sell something that doesn't already exist. Most of the risk goes to the investor. You're selling shares. If you sell 100% of a business, he's responsible for it. There's no risk sharing like there is in PPP. And the most important calculation for privatization is valuation. How much is the business worth? Whereas for PPP, they are long-term, but only for a fixed time period. As we saw on the definition of PPP on the law, 5 years minimum. Usually for infrastructure projects, I would say power plants and roads, 15 years would be quite short. 20 to 35 years is pretty common. I did see a reference to a toll road project that was a 99-year contract, but that's because roads last forever. The ownership at the end of a PPP transfers to the government, or maybe at the beginning sometimes, but ultimately the government owns the assets, whereas here, of course, the assets stay with the private sector. They involve risk sharing. We will talk a lot about risk sharing in the coming day or so, but that means government, unlike this, the guy gives you a check and you just let him go. And this one, you're probably paying him, and you're involved throughout the life of the project, which is why contract management is so important. And the calculation that you need to worry about for PPPs is something called VFM, value for money. We will discuss that in very tedious detail a bit later, but what I will say is it is basically a calculation that demonstrates that doing a project by PPP is actually better for the economy than just doing the traditional EPC kind of tender. So everything about PPP is value for money. Is it going to be better than doing it the normal way? So, if you want to know the shortcut, the easy way to work out the difference between PPP and privatization, with privatization, effectively you're selling something. With PPP, effectively you are buying something. That something is services or services and assets. So, based on that, there are other structures, there are other types of contract that you can have between the public and private sector that are not PPP. As we said, privatization is not PPP. Also, very short-term services type contracts, management contracts, O&M agreements, computer maintenance, IT services, they are not PPP, even if you have a private contractor. Why? Because firstly, they're too short. 5 years is not long enough to make the guy really worry about something. If say you've got a contract which says, you, Mr. Service Provider, have got to provide 100% coverage across the whole city in 10 districts. Now, there may be 8 districts where that's easy, and 2 districts where he'll have to spend a lot of money to get 100% coverage. If he's got a 20-year contract, it's worth him spending that money, because otherwise he'll be being penalized for 20 years. If he's only got a 2-year contract, he'll look at the numbers and say, well, I'm not going to wait, I'm not going to spend this money, I'd much rather take the penalties. So it has to be long enough, and it has to give the risk, enough risk. Again, if you think about a management contract or a typical consultancy contract, what you're paying for, you'll get a proposal that says, this guy will cost you so much per day, this guy will cost you so much per day, this is my expenses, and you pay based on the inputs. Whereas with a PPP, to make sure he has the risk, you pay on his outputs. So again, management contracts in particular, it's very difficult to be PPPs. You can structure PPPs with all of these things, but certainly they have to be long-term, and we'll get to that a bit later as well. This is what you call the traditional procurement. Engineering EPC contracts, design and build contracts, where you're just basically telling somebody, go and design and build me this thing, or even just build-only contracts. These are not PPPs because government takes all the risks. You may not pay him until after he's built it, but eventually, so long as he meets the code, you have to pay him. There's no risk to him other than the fact that he does a terrible job. There's also something called design build finance, which is where you hire a guy, hire a contractor. You say, I need to build this. Say I want to build a hospital, well, not that big, maybe a clinic. I need to build a clinic here, but we're in halfway through the budget year, and I don't actually have enough money left in my budget to pay you this year. So you, Mr. Contractor, if you can go to the bank and borrow the money to build this thing, and I promise I'll pay you next year. That's called a design build finance. And again, this is not a PPP because there's not really a risk transfer. Basically the bank is quite happy to lend for that because the contract will say definitely government says he's going to pay. And finally, there is something called a public domain contract. Oil and gas licenses or mining concessions, for example, they involve a lot of private sector investment, but they're not PPPs because the private partner is taking all the risk. The concession, say a mining concession, is a contract that says, I'm going to kick this thing over in a minute, is a contract that says, here's a big patch of land. You have paid me for this license, you Mr. Private Guy. You have the right to dig up as many holes as you like to find stuff. And if you find stuff, you can build the infrastructure and extract it and just pay me a license fee. But at the end of the day, once the thing expires, everything goes back to the government. But during it, government has not taken any risk. You get all the upside. In other words, if he finds oil or if he finds diamonds or gold or whatever it is, you'll get the license fees. But if he doesn't find it, he bears the cost, not you. So again, PPP needs risk sharing and significant risk sharing between the two parties. So we have a quiz. You'll find as we go along that I will be quizzing you on how much you've learned. And the way I'll do it is put up the question here, read them out, and then it's just a general shout out the answer or keep quiet and hope that the guy next to you will shout out the right answer. And there's no compulsion, there's no scoring. But if you want to have references, those of you who got the slides should have got the version that don't have the answers on it. So if you want to keep a record of the answers, you should write them down. Okay, so which of the following is not a fundamental feature of PPP? Is it risk sharing between government and private contractor? The private contractor arranges financing. Payment to the contractor depends on its performance. PPP is an alternative to EPC. It's B. Yep. The phrase is fundamental feature. And as I said, I made a big thing at the beginning that financing is often part of PPP, but it doesn't have to be. Sometimes as government, especially the Saudi government, which is not under such great budget pressures as say, Tanzania or somebody like that, at the end of the day, it might be easier just for you to pay for the infrastructure and just get the guy to run it. C is definitely part of a PPP because this is how you transfer risk. He has to take a risk on his performance that he will make less profit if he performs badly. Therefore, he gets paid if he does a good job. Yeah.
You said that C is a part of the PPP.
Yes.
What's the difference between PPP and traditional procurement? Because usually in traditional procurement, we pay for the contractor based on his performance, and for the project, it's going to be on phases, yeah?
Yeah, but payment stops when he finishes building it.
Of course.
Whereas
Here,
yeah, but also the contract with a EPC petitional contract, the only way you can not pay him is either if you might have penalties for delays. You might have if he fails to meet the construction standards and the plan. That's the only reason you can't pay him. He won't get paid more if he does it quicker. He won't get paid more if he